The dress was finished, and it was the most beautiful thing Ellen Brooks had ever made with her own 2 hands. She stood in the center of the small sewing room at the back of the Redmond house, holding it up against the afternoon light that poured through the single dusty window, watching the pale blue calico shimmer like water over river stones. Her throat was tight. Her eyes burned, because the dress was not for her. It was for a dead woman. That was my mother's fabric. The voice came from the doorway, and Ellen turned so fast the dress nearly slipped from her fingers. Nora Redmond stood there, 12 years old and wire-thin, with her father's dark eyes and a look on her face that could have stripped paint from a barn wall. She was not crying. That would have been easier. She was looking at the dress the way a person looks at something they hate because they love it too much. Ellen's mouth opened. She had no words. She had sewn that dress in secret, rising before dawn for 3 mornings in a row, working by lamplight until her fingers were stiff and her back ached, because she had wanted to give the child something beautiful. She had found the bolt of blue calico in the cedar chest in the storeroom, and she had not known. She had not asked. And that was the worst part, the unforgivable part. The thing that Wallace Redmond was going to see when he walked through that door any second now and found his daughter standing rigid with grief and his housekeeper standing guilty with a dress that should never have been cut. "Nora," Ellen said carefully, "I did not know it was hers. Father said not to touch that chest. He told me the storeroom was mine to organize. He did not mean that chest." The sound of boots on the porch boards came then, slow and deliberate. The kind of footsteps that belonged to a man who had spent 15 years learning how much weight the world could put on a person before they buckled. Wallace Redmond filled the doorway behind his daughter, and his eyes went from the blue dress in Ellen's hands to the rigid set of his daughter's shoulders, and Ellen watched something move across his face that she could not name. It was not anger. It was deeper than anger. It was the face of a man who had been trying very hard for a very long time to keep 2 separate griefs from colliding, and who had just watched them collide anyway. "Ellen," he said, just her name, nothing else. She had been in Harlan Creek, Colorado Territory, for exactly 43 days. She had arrived in the last week of September 1878, stepping down from the Butterfield stage with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter of employment in the other. A woman of 26 with no living family, no particular prospects, and a skill with needle and thread that a schoolteacher in Denver had told her was worth something out on the frontier where seamstresses were scarce. The letter had been sent by a solicitor acting on behalf of one Wallace Redmond of Harlan Creek, a cattle rancher and widower who required a housekeeper to manage his home and his difficult, grief-stricken daughter. The solicitor had used the word difficult 3 times in 2 paragraphs. Ellen had not minded. She had been called difficult herself. Harlan Creek was a town in the early stages of deciding whether it wanted to survive or not. Main Street was a wide dirt road with a general mercantile, a post office, a livery stable, a small frame church with peeling white paint, a saloon called the Copper Spur that stayed loudly open until well past midnight, and a 2-room schoolhouse at the eastern end that served 14 children of varying ages. There was a doctor named Horace Fenn, who was also the dentist, a Chinese laundry run by a family named Song who were treated with a level of casual cruelty that made Ellen's stomach turn every time she saw it, and a sheriff named Dale Packard who seemed to spend most of his time sleeping in his chair. Beyond the town itself, the land spread out in all directions in vast, windswept rolls of yellow grass and red rock, and if you stood on the ridge above the Redmond property at sunset, the sky turned colors that had no names in any language Ellen knew. Wallace Redmond had met her at the stage himself. She had recognized him immediately, not because she had any description beyond tall widower, but because he was standing apart from the small crowd of onlookers with his hat in his hands and the particular stillness of a man who was not sure he had made the right decision, but had made it anyway and intended to see it through. He was tall. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and eyes the color of strong coffee that assessed her with a directness that she found startling and then immediately respected. He had shaken her hand. He had taken her bag. He had said, in a voice that was low and even and left no room for embellishment, that his daughter Nora was 12 and had not spoken more than 20 words to any adult outside of schoolteacher Miss Calloway since her mother died 14 months prior, and that if Ellen found the situation untenable she was welcome to say so now, and he would put her back on the next stage with her fare paid. Ellen had looked at him for a long moment. "I am not easily deterred," she had said. Something had shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Something quieter than a smile and more significant. "Good," he had said, and picked up her bag, and that was the beginning of it. The house was a good house for the territory, larger than she had expected, built of pine boards and river stone with a wide porch that ran the full length of the front, and a kitchen that received the morning sun. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, a parlor, the kitchen, and that small back room that had clearly been used as a sewing room at some point, because there was a treadle sewing machine against one wall and a cutting table, and a wooden rack where thread spools were still lined up in careful order of color from white through to deep indigo. The cedar chest sat under the window. Ellen had not opened it for the first 3 weeks. She had busied herself with the kitchen, which was catastrophically disorganized, and the parlor, which was thick with dust that suggested no one had sat in it since the previous year, and the general running of a household for a man who had been managing on minimal sleep and maximum stubbornness for over a year. Nora had watched her from a distance, always from a distance. The child would appear in doorways and then disappear. She ate her meals in near silence. She did her schoolwork at the kitchen table without being asked, which surprised Ellen. She was not a lazy child or a stupid child. She was a child who had built a wall and was standing behind it with her arms crossed, daring the world to try and breach it. Ellen did not try to breach it. She had understood walls. She had built a few herself. She simply existed in the same space. She cooked meals that were better than adequate. She kept the house clean. She did not ask Nora about her feelings or her mother or her grief, because she sensed immediately that direct questions were the fastest way to drive the child further behind her wall. Instead she talked, not at Nora, just in general. In the kitchen while she was working she would talk about small things, the quality of the flour, the temperament of the rooster in the yard, the fact that the 3rd step on the staircase had a nail working loose and someone was going to turn an ankle on it if it was not attended to. On the 19th day, Nora had said, "The nail has been loose since before." Ellen had looked up from the bread she was kneading. "Before," she had repeated, not as a question. "Before Mama died," Nora said, and then looked as though she regretted saying it. Did she mean to fix it? Ellen asked conversationally, as though this were an ordinary exchange. A pause. She meant to tell Father to fix it. That seems like a reasonable division of labor. Another pause, and then something that was almost not a smile but occupied the same general territory. She said he was better at being told than at thinking of things himself. Ellen had laughed, genuinely, and Nora had looked startled by the laugh, and then the child had disappeared again. But the wall had developed a crack. Wallace Redmond was not, Ellen discovered, better at being told than at thinking of things himself. He was in fact extremely capable. He ran 400 head of cattle on 1,500 acres with 2 full-time ranch hands. A man named Cass Holloway, who was 60, and had been with the Redmond family since Wallace was a boy, and a younger man named Pete Sara, who was 22 and devoted and afraid of very little except rattlesnakes and Nora's cold stare. He kept his books meticulously. He repaired what needed repairing. He made decisions about grazing and water rights and cattle prices with the quiet confidence of a man who had been raised to this work and knew it in his bones. What he could not do, Ellen observed, was be in 2 places at once. And what Nora needed was someone in the house, in the daily hours of the day, who was present and consistent and not drowned in their own grief. Because Wallace was grieving too. Ellen saw it in the evenings, after Nora was in bed, when he would sit at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger open in front of him, and sometimes just stare at a point on the wall above the stove for 5 or 10 minutes without moving. She did not interrupt those silences. She would pour tea, set a cup near his elbow, and continue whatever quiet task she had for herself. He would come back from wherever he had gone, look at the tea, and then look at her, and there was always a moment of something unspoken between them before he picked up the cup and returned to his ledger. His wife's name had been Clara. He never said her name in Ellen's presence for the first 3 weeks, and then one evening in the 5th week he said it, completely without warning, in the middle of a conversation about whether the root cellar needed new shelving. He said Clara was going to have someone build proper shelving in there, and then stopped, and the silence that followed was the loudest Ellen had ever sat inside of. What kind of shelving? She had asked after a moment. He had looked at her with an expression that was partly surprise and partly something very close to relief. Deep enough for the preserving jars, he had said. She put up more preserves than any family of 3 could ever eat through a winter, but she said if you had them, you had them. Ellen had nodded. That is sensible. She was a sensible woman. Tell me something else about her, Ellen said, and this was a risk, and she knew it was a risk, but she took it anyway. Wallace was quiet for a long time. Then he said she sang. Not well, but constantly. Everything was a reason to sing. Hanging laundry, making biscuits, driving the wagon to town. Nora has her mother's way of going very still when something matters to her. Clara would go completely quiet right before she said something important, and Nora does the same thing, and every time she does it I have to take a second. He stopped. He picked up the ledger and opened it to the wrong page and then set it down again. I am sorry, Ellen said, for both of you. I know you are, he said, and there was something in his voice that was different from gratitude. Something that was more personal than gratitude. I can tell. That was the night Ellen had gone back to her room, which was a small but decent room off the kitchen, and lain awake for an hour thinking about the way Wallace Redmond said things. He had a quality of absolute honesty that was unusual in her experience. He did not perform feelings he did not have, and he did not conceal feelings out of social politeness. He said what was true. She found this terrifying and wonderful in approximately equal measure. The storeroom, he had told her in her 2nd week, was hers to manage as she saw fit. He never used it. Clara had used it for sewing and preserving and various household activities, and since Clara died it had just been a closed door. If there was anything in there Ellen could use, she was welcome to it. The cedar chest he had not mentioned, because in his mind telling her to use the storeroom covered everything in it, and in his mind the cedar chest was simply furniture, because the grief was so thick around it that he had stopped seeing it as a separate object at all. Ellen had opened it on her 38th day, looking for trim or extra thread, and found Clara Redmond's fabric collection. It was carefully organized. There were calicos and muslin, and a length of good wool, and various other pieces in various states of completion. The blue calico had been at the top, folded with the precision of a woman who valued her materials. It was 4 yards, more than enough for a girl's dress. Ellen had looked at it for a long time. She had not known it was sacred. She had thought about how Nora wore the same 3 dresses on rotation, and how all 3 were getting short and tight in the way of a growing girl, and how twice now Ellen had caught Nora looking at the dresses displayed in the window of Hartley's Mercantile on their trips to town with an expression that was immediately hidden when she noticed Ellen noticing. Ellen had asked once casually whether Nora would like a new dress, and Nora had said flatly that she did not need one. Ellen had not pushed. She had simply done what she did when something needed doing, and the person who needed it was not ready to ask for it. She had acted quietly in the dark before anyone was awake, and she had cut Clara's fabric without knowing it was Clara's. 3 mornings of early rising. 3 sets of careful measurements. taken while helping Nora with her coat one morning in a way that was completely calculated and slightly dishonest, and done with total love. She had followed the simple pattern for a young girl's dress from the same worn book of patterns she had brought in her carpetbag from Denver, and she had made it with the kind of attention that a person gives to work that matters to them, and it was beautiful, and it was wrong. And now it was the center of a storm that she had created entirely through good intentions and incomplete information. Nora said from the doorway with her father behind her, "That is Mama's fabric." "I know," Ellen said. "I am so sorry, Nora, I did not know. What were you going to do with it?" Ellen looked at the child. She looked at the dress. She looked at Wallace, who was watching her with an expression she could not entirely read. "I was going to give it to you," she said. "I wanted you to have something new that was made for you. I saw how you looked at the dresses in Hartley's window and I thought." She stopped. "I thought wrong," she said. "I am sorry." Nora's jaw was working. She was doing the thing Wallace had described, going very still, and Ellen braced. "It is beautiful," Nora said, and her voice broke on the last word, and then she was crying, which Ellen had never seen her do. And Wallace moved past Ellen and put his arms around his daughter and held her, and Ellen stood there with the blue dress and felt like the most complete intruder on the surface of the earth. She set the dress carefully on the cutting table. She slipped past them both and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because it was the only thing she knew how to do that seemed appropriate. She stood at the stove and listened to the sounds from the other room, muffled and distant, and she pressed her knuckles against her mouth and breath through her nose until she was sure she was not going to add her own tears to the situation. She had been so careful. She had been so deliberately careful about not imposing, not overstepping, not trying to replace what could not be replaced. And she had done it anyway. Not through arrogance but through ignorance, which in some ways was worse, because ignorance had no malice to defend against. When Wallace came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, Nora was not with him. Ellen had the tea poured and was sitting at the table, and she stood up when he entered. "She went upstairs," he said. "She is all right." "I am deeply sorry, Wallace, if I had known." "I know." He sat down. He looked at the tea she had poured. He looked at her. "It was my fault," he said. "I should have told you about the chest." "You should not have had to." "Ellen." He said her name with a weight that made her stop talking. "You were trying to do something kind for my daughter. You did not know. The fault for that is mine and no one else's." She sat back down. "How is she truly?" He was quiet for a moment. "She said the dress is the most beautiful thing she has ever seen. She also said she is not sure she can wear it." Ellen nodded. "That is reasonable. She asked me." He stopped. He looked at his hands flat on the table. "She asked me if you would teach her to sew." Ellen went very still. "She said if she could learn to sew it herself, then maybe she could feel like she made it herself," he said, "and then maybe she could wear it." Ellen understood this with her entire body. The logic of grief, the way the heart negotiated with loss in order to find a way forward. "Of course I will," she said immediately. "There is enough of that fabric left for a second dress," he said. Nora measured with her eyes apparently. "She said there is at least another full dress in what is left." "There is," Ellen confirmed. "I had originally planned on having enough to make a second in case I made errors, but I did not make errors." He looked at her for a long moment. "You do not make many of those, do you?" "I make a great many," she said. "I made one this morning that I will be thinking about for a while." "You were being kind," he said. "That is not an error. It caused harm. It also caused my daughter to cry for the first time in 14 months, he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I have been waiting for her to cry. I was beginning to think she had locked it up somewhere past where I could reach her." Ellen looked at him. She was crying over the dress. She was crying over her mother, he said. The dress just opened the door, and that, he stopped again. He had a way of stopping at the most important part of a sentence and waiting, as though he needed to be sure of the words before he committed to them. "That needed to happen, so I am not certain you made an error." They sat in the kitchen in the afternoon light, and the kettle whispered on the stove, and outside Cass Holloway could be heard telling Pete Sara to do something about the fence post near the east gate, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch carried on around them while something between them shifted with the particular quietness of a thing that has been changing gradually and has only now become visible. "I will teach her," Ellen said. "Whatever she needs." "She needs a great deal," Wallace said. "She needs more than I have been able to give her. You have given her everything you had." "Yes," he said simply, "and it was not always enough. That is the fact of it." Ellen considered her next words. "You cannot be both parents," she said. "No one can. It is not an indictment of you. It is just a truth." He looked at her with an expression that was complicated and raw and unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him. "When I placed that advertisement," he said, "I told myself I was looking for a housekeeper. Someone to manage the practical side of things so I could focus on the ranch and spend my evenings with Nora instead of worrying about whether there was food in the larder." "That is what you hired," Ellen said carefully. "That is what I told myself," he said. "But when you got off that stage and shook my hand and said you were not easily deterred, I thought." He stopped. Ellen waited. "I thought," he said, "that if I was honest with myself I had been hoping for someone like you." The kitchen was very quiet. "Like me," she repeated. "Someone who is not afraid of difficult things," he said. "Someone who is honest without being unkind. Someone who can be in the same room with grief and not flinch from it." "Those are qualities of a good employee," she said, and she said it lightly, because she was afraid of the other thing the sentence might contain. "Yes," he said, and he was looking at her directly the way he always did, with that uncomfortable honesty that was one of the most alarming and compelling things about him. "Yes, they are." He stood up. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. He paused with his hand on the doorframe, his back to her. "The second dress," he said, "the one that will be made from what is left, I would like it to be yours." He walked out to the yard before she could respond. Ellen sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the door closed. She pressed her hand flat against the table's surface and felt the worn grain of the wood under her palm and thought about what had just happened and what it meant and what she was going to do about it. She was a housekeeper. She was employed. She had come to Harlan Creek with $43 and a carpetbag and a letter of employment and no illusions about her situation. She was not a woman with land or family or standing. She was capable and educated enough, thanks to a schoolteacher mother who had insisted on it, but she was in a position of dependency in this household, and she was acutely aware of what that meant for any feeling she might allow herself to have about the man who owned it. She was also 26 years old, and she had been lonely for longer than she cared to admit, and Wallace Redmond had just told her he had hoped for someone like her, and she was human, and she was not entirely made of restraint. She refilled her tea and thought about it practically. She had been sent here by a solicitor. She had a salary of $12 a month, which was reasonable for the territory. She had a room and her meals. She had no reason to leave and no particular place to go if she did. She also had, she realized with a clarity that was slightly vertiginous, no desire whatsoever to leave. She had grown attached to this house and this child and this territory's impossible sunsets and the way Wallace Redmond said her name when something mattered. She had been lonely in Denver in ways she had never let herself look at directly. She had worked as a seamstress in a dress shop and boarded in a house with 4 other women, and had gone through her days with a kind of careful efficiency that kept the loneliness at a manageable distance. She had come to Harlan Creek for practical reasons. She had stayed in her own mind for practical reasons. She was now beginning to suspect that the practical reasons were a very thin explanation for a much larger reality. She washed the tea cups. She started thinking about what to make for supper. The next morning she knocked on Nora's bedroom door. Nora opened it in her school clothes, her dark hair in its customary single braid. She looked at Ellen with those father's eyes and waited. "I was wondering," Ellen said, "if you would like to learn how to sew. Your father mentioned you had an interest. We could start this Saturday if school is not in session." Nora was quiet for a moment. "You would teach me on the machine." "We would start by hand," Ellen said. "The machine is easier to learn once you understand what the needle and thread are doing and why, But if you want to learn the machine first, we can do that too. Nora chewed the inside of her cheek. What would we make? The rest of your mother's blue calico is sitting in the sewing room, Ellen said. There is enough for a second dress. Your father suggested it might be for me, but I think that should be your decision, not his. Something sparked in Nora's eyes. He said it should be for you. He suggested it, Ellen said carefully. Nora considered this for several seconds with the focused deliberation of a person working out a complex equation. Mama would have liked you, she said finally, and it was said with a directness that was completely characteristic of her father and completely devastating in its simplicity. Ellen breathed. That is one of the kindest things anyone has ever said to me, she said. I did not say it to be kind, Nora said, in a tone that was somehow simultaneously 12 years old and also ancient. I said it because it is true. Yes, Ellen said, I know that is why it was kind. Nora almost smiled. Saturday, she said, after breakfast. Saturday came with a cold wind from the north that rattled the windows and made the kitchen necessary for warmth. Nora appeared at the sewing room door at 8:30, before Ellen had even finished her first cup of coffee, and looked at Ellen with the expression of someone who had decided to commit to a thing and was not going to give themselves time to talk themselves out of it. They spent the morning with needle and thread, working on a simple practice piece of muslin. Ellen taught the way her mother had taught her, which was without condescension and without impatience, explaining not just what to do but why. Nora was a quick learner in the specific way that a child is quick when they actually want to learn something, as opposed to the way they learn when they are simply complying. She held the needle wrong for the first 20 minutes, corrected her grip when Ellen showed her, and then held it correctly without ever reverting. Wallace appeared in the doorway around mid-morning with 2 cups of coffee and a piece of cornbread each on a plate. He set them on the cutting table without a word and looked at the practice piece in Nora's hands. His daughter looked up at him. Something passed between them, a communication of the kind that lives between people who have weathered something terrible together, and Wallace touched the top of Nora's head briefly and then looked at Ellen over his daughter's head and said nothing. But the look said something, and Ellen held onto her end of it and felt it travel all the way through her. He left. They ate their cornbread and kept sewing. By early afternoon they had moved on to the blue calico. Ellen had cut the pieces the evening before, not wanting to do it in front of Nora, in case the cutting felt too much like destruction. But Nora had asked to watch her cut the next piece, and so Ellen cut the bodice facing while Nora observed with her chin propped on her hand and an expression of fierce concentration. Mama tried to teach me once, Nora said, while Ellen's shears moved through the fabric. I said I did not want to learn. Ellen kept cutting. Why not? I thought it was dull, Nora said. I wanted to learn to rope cattle instead. Father taught Cass Holloway's daughter when she was 8, and I thought it was not fair that I was not taught. Did your father teach you? He tried, Nora said. I was terrible at it. The rope went everywhere except where I wanted it. A pause. I am better at this. You are, Ellen agreed. You have good hands for it. Nora looked at her hands. Mama had good hands for it. Then you come by it honestly, Ellen said. The afternoon wore on. They worked in companionable quiet broken by questions and answers and occasional instructions, and the dress took shape slowly in the way that all made things take shape, piece by piece, with each step revealing the logic of the step before it. Nora's stitches were uneven at first and then less uneven, and by the time the light was fading and Ellen lit the lamp she was doing work that was genuinely good for a first attempt. Will it be ready for Sunday church? Nora asked. Not this Sunday, Ellen said. There is still the skirt to complete and the hem and the buttons, but the Sunday after, yes. Nora nodded. She looked at the half-assembled bodice in her hands. Ellen, she said, yes. Will you make the second dress? She said it without looking up. The one Father suggested, I think it would be right, for you to have a dress from Mama's fabric because she would have wanted you to have it. Ellen was very still. Nora, she was generous with her things, Nora said. She always said that pretty things should be shared or they are just clutter. She looked up then. So I think you should have it. I think she would want that. Ellen said very quietly. Then I will make it. They worked for another hour. When Wallace called them for supper, Nora carefully folded the dress pieces and set them on the cutting table, and then she did something she had not done in the 45 days since Ellen's arrival. She took Ellen's hand briefly and squeezed it, and then walked ahead into the kitchen. Ellen stood in the sewing room for a moment by herself and pressed Clara Redmond's blue calico between her palms and thought about generosity and grief and the strange paths that people take toward each other. Supper that night was different, not dramatically different, but the quality of the silence at the table had changed. Nora talked. Not a great deal, but she talked, describing the morning's lesson with a precision that made Wallace's eyebrows rise, because she used terminology she had not known that morning, and had clearly absorbed with the thoroughness of someone who takes their learning seriously. Wallace asked questions, and Nora answered them, and Ellen sat across from him, and watched the careful love he had for his daughter operate in real time, and felt something inside her that was too large and too warm to be comfortable. After supper, after Nora had gone up to bed, Ellen was washing the dishes when Wallace came to stand near the window. He had the habit of standing near windows in the evenings. She had noticed it early on and decided it was the habit of a man who needed to keep one eye on the land even when he was inside. "She is different," he said. "She is the same," Ellen said. "She is just choosing to let more of it show." "Because of you. Because she was ready," Ellen said. "I just happened to be here when it happened." "Do not minimize it," he said with a quiet firmness that was not unkind. Ellen dried her hands on the dish towel. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that directness that she had never entirely gotten used to, the quality of attention he gave her that was different from anything she had experienced before, a kind of looking that did not glance away and did not pretend to be something other than what it was. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I said yesterday." "About the dress," she said carefully. "Among other things." She waited. "I am aware," he said, "of your position in this household. I am aware that you came here as an employee, and that I am your employer, and that there is an imbalance in that arrangement that I have no wish to exploit." "I appreciate that," she said. "I am also aware," he said, "that the imbalance is not the whole truth of what this is." She looked at the dish towel in her hands. She set it down on the counter. "No," she said, "it is not. I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said, "and I am not a man who moves quickly into things he has not thought about. I have thought about this." "What conclusion did you reach?" she asked. "That I would like to ask you to have supper with me," he said, "not as your employer. As a man who would like to know you better. On a Sunday, perhaps, if Nora would tolerate being with Cass and his wife for an afternoon." Ellen looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Denver and the dress shop and the boarding house and the 4 women she had lived with and the loneliness she had never let herself look at directly. She thought about the stage to Harlan Creek and the way he had been standing apart from the crowd with his hat in his hands. She thought about 45 days of shared meals and shared grief and the sound of his boots on the porch boards in the evening when the ranch work was done. "I would like that," she said. The Sunday supper happened 2 weeks later, in the second week of November. Nora had agreed to spend the afternoon with Cass Holloway and his wife Dottie with a kind of elaborate casualness that suggested she knew exactly what was happening and had decided to approve of it without acknowledging that she was doing so. Wallace drove Ellen the 3 miles to the hotel dining room in Harlan Creek, which was the closest thing the town had to a restaurant, and which offered a menu of roasted chicken and beef stew and a surprisingly good apple pie. They sat across a small table covered with a white cloth and talked for 2 hours about everything, about his family and hers. His father had been a rancher and his father before him, and the Redmond land had been in the family for 20 years, built up acre by acre through work that Wallace did not romanticize but clearly respected. His mother was still living, a small, fierce woman in Santa Fe who wrote him letters of considerable length and specificity regarding how he should be managing his life. Clara had been his childhood sweetheart, the daughter of the neighboring rancher, a woman he had known since he was 10 years old, and had married at 22 with the absolute certainty of someone who had never needed to question it. Her death had been sudden, a fever that moved with a terrible speed through the settlement in the summer of 1877, and he had been left with Nora and the ranch, and a grief so acute that he had simply put his head down and worked and kept working because the alternative was a darkness he did not allow himself to look at. Ellen talked about her own life with the directness that his honesty seemed to require from her. Her parents had both died within 2 years of each other, her father first and then her mother, and she had been 22 with no siblings and no inheritance and a very good skill set for someone who needed to earn her own living. Denver had been practical. The dress shop had been practical. The advertisement in the Denver newspaper for a housekeeper in the Colorado Territory had been practical in exactly the way that a person is practical when they have been practical for so long that they have nearly forgotten what they actually want. "What do you actually want?" he asked, and the question was so direct and so unexpected that she laughed. She stopped. She looked at the candle in the middle of the table. "I want to be somewhere that matters to me. Not a place I am at because it is the available place, a place I have chosen and that has chosen me back." He was quiet for a moment. "And is Harlan Creek?" "Do not ask me that yet," she said. "It has only been 7 weeks. "Fair enough," he said, and there was that almost smile, the quiet thing that was more significant than a full smile. He drove her home in the dark under a sky so full of stars that it seemed improbable, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat with the cold air sharp on her face and the warmth of him close at her side. And when they pulled up to the house, he helped her down from the wagon and held her hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary and said, "Thank you for tonight." "Thank you," she said. "I would like to do this again," he said. "So would I," she said, and went inside. The second dress got made slowly, over the course of 3 weeks, because the sewing lessons with Nora were the priority, and the second dress was made in the evenings after Nora was in bed, and also because Ellen took more care with it than she had taken with anything in recent memory. She did not use the treadle machine. She made it by hand, every stitch, the same way she had been teaching Nora, because it seemed right that both dresses be made the same way. The blue calico became a dress that fit her properly in every way, with a bodice that was snug through the shoulders and full through the skirt, and a neckline that was modest but not severe. And when she held it up in the lamplight of the sewing room on a cold December evening, she thought it was the best thing she had ever made. Nora's dress was finished first. It was ready on the second Sunday of November, as promised. Ellen had pressed it with the iron and hung it on the door of Nora's room early in the morning before the child was awake, and when Nora came down to breakfast she was wearing it, and Wallace was already at the table, and he looked at his daughter in her blue calico dress and was quiet for a long moment with an expression that was grief and pride and love in equal measure. "You look beautiful," he said. Nora sat down in her chair. "Ellen made most of it," she said, "but I did the buttons." "The buttons are perfectly even," Ellen said from the stove. "I measured twice." "She made me measure twice," Nora confirmed. They went to church that Sunday, all 3 of them, and Nora sat in the pew between Ellen and her father in her blue calico dress, and Mrs. Hartley from the Mercantile leaned over after the service and said it was the prettiest dress she had seen this season and who had made it, and Nora said, without hesitation, "Ellen and I made it. It was my mother's fabric." Mrs. Hartley looked at Ellen with the particular expression of a woman who is doing arithmetic and does not want to be seen doing it. And Ellen looked back at her with the calm expression of a woman who does not care what arithmetic anyone is doing about her. And that was the end of that conversation. The Copper Spur, the town's saloon, was the source of Harlan Creek's only real violence, and in December it produced an incident that brought the fragile social geography of the town into sharp focus. A group of men passing through from somewhere east had taken exception to the Song family's laundry operation, on the grounds of reasons that had nothing to do with reason, and had broken a window and shouted things that Ellen, passing on the opposite boardwalk with Nora and a list of errands, heard clearly and found intolerable. She stopped. Nora stopped beside her. Ellen turned and walked across the street toward the Song family's laundry. The men were gone by then, moved on to the copper spur, but Mrs. Song and her daughter were sweeping glass from the doorway, and Ellen walked up and said, in a voice that was entirely level, "Good afternoon. Can I help?" Mrs. Song looked at her with the careful expression of a person who has learned not to assume that a white woman's assistance comes without a price. Ellen met her eyes without flinching. "Glass," Ellen said simply, and took the spare broom leaning against the wall and began to sweep. Nora stood for a moment and then came forward and crouched down and began picking up larger pieces of glass with her bare hands, which Ellen immediately stopped. "You will cut yourself," Ellen said. "Use the dustpan." Nora used the dustpan. They worked for 20 minutes. Mrs. Song said very little. Her daughter, who was perhaps 15, said thank you in careful English, and Ellen said, "You are welcome. I am sorry this happened." When they walked back across the street toward Hartley's Mercantile, Nora was quiet for a block and then said, "Those men were wrong." "Yes," Ellen said. "Father says that wrong things happen in the territory because the law is thin and people use thin law to do what they want," Nora said. "Your father is right about that." "It is not just," Nora said. "No," Ellen said. "It is not." Nora was quiet again. "But you did something." "A small thing," Ellen said. "Small things are still things," Nora said, with the absolute philosophical certainty of 12, and Ellen thought that Clara Redmond must have been an extraordinary woman to have produced this child. When she told Wallace that evening what had happened, he was quiet in the way that meant he was holding more feelings than he was going to display. Then he said, "I will speak to Dale Packard about those men." "Dale Packard was asleep in his chair when it happened," Ellen said. "I know," Wallace said, in a tone that suggested he had a number of opinions about Dale Packard that he was also not going to fully display. "I will speak to him anyway." "The window needs replacing," Ellen said. "I will see to it," he said. He saw to it the next morning, taking Pete Sora to help him carry the new pane of glass from the Mercantile supplies to the Song laundry. And he did it without announcement or expectation of credit. And Ellen heard about it from Mrs. Hartley, who told her about it in the way that people in small towns communicate things they think are significant, which is in the middle of an apparently unrelated conversation about the price of flour. Christmas came with a dusting of snow that turned the red and yellow landscape momentarily white, and then melted by afternoon into muddy red again. Ellen made a ham and 3 pies and 2 kinds of bread, and a gingerbread that Nora declared was the best thing she had ever eaten, which Ellen suspected was an exaggeration, but accepted graciously. Wallace had ridden to the neighboring Coulter ranch, and returned with a small pine tree tied to the saddle that Nora and Ellen decorated with paper stars and pieces of ribbon, and 3 glass ornaments that came from the cedar chest, produced by Nora herself, who had gone to get them with a deliberateness that suggested she had thought it over and decided it was time. Wallace had given Ellen a gift that Christmas morning, a small package wrapped in brown paper. She opened it at the kitchen table while Nora pretended to look out the window. It was a sewing case, leather with a brass clasp, containing a full set of needles of different gauges, a seam ripper, small sharp scissors, and thread in 15 colors, all of them quality materials from a shop in Denver, which meant he had ordered them by post weeks ago, which meant he had been thinking about giving her something for weeks. She looked up at him. "Your needles are a disgrace," he said. "2 of them are bent." "Thank you," she said. "It is a practical gift." "I know," she said. "I like practical gifts." He held her gaze for a moment. "Good," he said. Nora turned from the window and said, with suspicious innocence, "Now can we have the gingerbread?" January brought the hard cold of a Colorado winter, and the house contracted around its fire like something alive preserving its warmth. Ellen finished her blue calico dress in the 2nd week of January and wore it to the Sunday service for the first time on a morning when ice crystals were forming on the inside of the windows, and the horse's breath made clouds in the stable yard. She put her coat over it for the drive to church, but when they took their coats off inside, Nora immediately noticed. "That is Mama's fabric," she said, not as accusation this time, as recognition, as the acknowledgement of a completed thing. "It is," Ellen said. Nora looked at the dress carefully. Then she looked up. "She would have approved of the fit," she said. "Mama said that most dresses are made for someone else's body, and that was a waste of good material." Ellen laughed. Across the pew, Wallace was watching her with that look, and she felt it settle somewhere in her chest and stay there. After the church service, standing in the winter sun outside the white-painted doors while people talked and children ran between adult legs, Sheriff Dale Packard approached Wallace with a conversation that Ellen was not privy to, but which resulted in Wallace's jaw going tight in a way she had learned to read. She waited until they were in the wagon heading home, Nora between them, before she raised an eyebrow at him. "The men from December," he said, carefully, with Nora listening. "There has been a complaint filed with the county sheriff about a land dispute near the eastern border of the Redmond property. It may require attention." "What kind of attention?" Ellen asked. "The legal kind, I hope," he said. "The kind that involves a solicitor in Denver. And the other kind," he glanced at her over Nora's head, "I am hoping it does not come to that." It did not, in the end, come to the other kind. The land dispute was a boundary question that had been technically unresolved since the original survey of the territory, and the men who had filed the complaint were speculators from back east who had bought a questionable deed and were trying to leverage it against established settlers. Wallace spent 3 weeks in correspondence with the county offices and with a solicitor in Denver, and the matter was resolved in late February when the speculator's deed was found to have been fraudulently obtained in the first place. The resolution was mundane and legal and entirely without drama, which Ellen considered a very satisfactory outcome. During those 3 weeks of worry and correspondence, a pattern developed between Ellen and Wallace that was different from what had come before. He would come in from the ranch in the late afternoon and find her in the kitchen or the sewing room, and he would sit down and talk through whatever had happened in the day with the ease of someone who has stopped keeping score of what they reveal. She listened. She responded. Sometimes she had no practical help to offer and said so, and he seemed to find even that useful. They talked about the ranch, about Nora, about the territory's politics, about books, about the small and large questions that people talk about when they have decided to let each other matter. He was well-read, which surprised some people in Harlan Creek and did not surprise Ellen at all. He had a preference for history and for practical science, and he had a particular appreciation for a volume of Emerson's essays that Ellen had brought in her carpetbag, and which he borrowed without asking, and returned 2 weeks later with pencil marks in the margins, which she took as a compliment. One evening in late February, while he was sitting at the kitchen table working through the correspondence about the land dispute, and she was at the other end of the same table with her mending, he said, without looking up from his paper, "I would like to ask you something." "Yes," she said. "That is not an answer yet," he said, looking up. "You do not know the question." "I am giving you permission to ask it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He set down his pen. "I have been thinking about the position you are in," he said. "Not the housekeeper position, your position here generally, in Harlan Creek, in this house." She set down her mending. "You came here on a practical arrangement," he said, "and practical arrangements are fine as far as they go, but I find that I no longer wish to have a practical arrangement with you." Her heart was doing something complicated. She kept her expression steady. "What I wish," he said, with the deliberate care of someone choosing every word, "is a great deal more than a practical arrangement. What I wish is to ask you to stay, not as a housekeeper." As he stopped, he looked at the table and then back at her. "As my wife," he said, "if you would consider it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses shifted in the stable. The fire crackled. Somewhere upstairs, Nora moved across her floor. "Wallace," she said. "I know it is soon," he said. I know you came here for practical reasons, and I have no right to ask for more than the arrangement you agreed to. You can say no. You can say you would prefer to keep the current arrangement. You can say you need time. All of those are legitimate answers, and I will honor any of them. You are giving me a great many ways to refuse you, she said. I am trying to be honest about the fact that I have power in this situation, and I do not want you to feel coerced by it, he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table. She thought about the stage from Denver and the $43 and the carpet bag. She thought about the way he stood at windows in the evenings. She thought about the way he had said she was not easily deterred and what had been in his voice when he said it. She thought about Christmas and the leather sewing case with the bent needles comment, and the way he touched the top of Nora's head with the tenderness of a man who is trying to give his child the world on a ranch budget. She thought about the blue calico dresses, both of them, one for his daughter and one for her, cut from the same fabric, sewn by different hands, beautiful in different ways. I do not feel coerced, she said. I feel asked. Is that all? I also feel she stopped. She was not a woman who was comfortable with vulnerability, which was exactly why it was the most honest thing she could offer him. I feel frightened, she said. Not of you, of wanting something very much. He was very still. I know that feeling, he said. I know you do, she said. And I know what you lost, and I am not asking you to not have lost it. I'm not asking you to pretend that anything about this is simple, because it is not simple. No, he said. But I am saying yes, she said. I am saying yes because I have been in this house for 4 months, and in those 4 months I have stopped wondering where I belong, and that is not a small thing for me. He stood up from the table. He walked around it to where she was sitting, and he stood in front of her, and she stood up, and he took both of her hands in his, and he held them for a moment, just held them, and then he said very quietly, I will not take that for granted. I know you will not, she said. They were married in April. The ceremony was small, performed in the Harlan Creek Church by Reverend Aldous Crane with Cass and Dottie Holloway as witnesses, and Nora standing beside her father with her hands folded and her blue calico dress on, and an expression of such composed satisfaction that Dottie Holloway later said the child looked like she had arranged the whole thing herself. Nora had not arranged the whole thing. But she had, Ellen suspected, done more than she let on. The morning after Wallace had proposed, Nora had appeared in the kitchen before breakfast and said, with characteristic bluntness, Father told me last night. I think it is right. And then she had poured herself a cup of milk and sat down and started on her schoolwork as though the matter were entirely settled, which in Nora's mind it clearly was. The wedding supper was at the Redmond house, not the hotel, because Ellen had requested it. She and Dottie Holloway and Mrs. Crane made enough food for 20 people, and 14 people came, which was most of the adult population of Harlan Creek who had been invited and had a reason to be there. The Song family came also, because Ellen had invited them, and Mrs. Hartley made a face at this that Ellen observed and declined to acknowledge. Wallace danced with her in the parlor after supper, with Pete Sora playing a fiddle with more enthusiasm than technique and Cass Holloway clapping the rhythm with enormous hands. And the parlor that had been dust and silence 4 months ago was full of light and noise and the smell of Dottie's apple cake. And Wallace looked at his wife in her blue calico dress and said, quietly against her hair, You are here. I am here, she said. I want you to know, he said, that I do not think of this as replacing what was before. I think of it as building on what was before. Does that make sense? It makes perfect sense, she said. Clara built this house and this family and this land with you. We build on it from here. He tightened his arm around her. Yes, he said, exactly that. Nora danced with Pete Sora, who was 22 and completely alarmed by being asked to dance by a 12-year-old with her father's eyes, and the watching adults found this very entertaining. Cass Holloway danced with his wife. Reverend Crane danced with no one but kept time with his foot. The lamplight was golden and warm, and the night outside was cold and clear and brilliant with stars. And Ellen thought that if someone had told her in Denver a year ago that her life would look like this, she would not have believed them. She was grateful for her own failure of imagination. Spring came to the territory with an extravagance that seemed almost deliberately theatrical after the long gray winter, everything bursting into yellow and purple, and the particular vivid green of grass after snow. The ranch came alive with the business of the season, calving and branding, and the general organized chaos of a cattle operation in spring, and Wallace was out from before dawn until after dark on most days. Ellen managed the house with the ease of someone who has fully inhabited a space and made it hers, and she took on the kitchen garden with a thoroughness that made Cass Holloway comment that she was going to put the prairie under cultivation if she was not stopped. Nora, who was now 13, continued her sewing lessons with a steady dedication. She had moved from hand sewing to the treadle machine with a confidence that pleased Ellen enormously, and she had in the early spring made herself a second dress, this one in a green cotton that she had chosen herself from Hartley's Mercantile with $3 of her own saved money, negotiated with some intensity. The dress was imperfect in several technical ways that Ellen pointed out and Nora corrected, and they debated over, but it was genuinely, recognizably a dress, and Nora wore it to school on its completion day with an air of someone who has done something and knows it. Her schoolteacher, Miss Calloway, who was young and earnest and slightly overwhelmed by the territory but deeply committed to her students, told Ellen at the post office one afternoon that Nora had become one of the most engaged students in her class in the past months. Ellen thanked her and then told Wallace that evening, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "She used to be, before." "She is again," Ellen said. He reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his. Just that. They had been married 3 months when the conversation they had both been careful not to have arrived of its own accord, late on a May evening, sitting on the porch in the cooling dark. "I want to ask you something," Ellen said. "Ask it," he said. "How do you feel about expanding this family?" she said. "If that were to happen." He turned to look at her. She could see his profile in the porch lamplight, the serious line of his jaw, the eyes that were attentive and unguarded. "Is that a hypothetical?" he asked. "It is becoming less hypothetical," she said. The silence was brief and complete, and then he said, "Are you telling me that you are?" "I believe so," she said. "I am not certain yet. But I believe so." He was quiet for a moment that she could not fully read in the dark. Then he said, "I am." He stopped. He started again. "When Clara was expecting Nora, I was terrified," he said. "And then Nora was born, and I was not terrified of that anymore. I was terrified of everything else. The territory, the winter, whether the ranch would last, whether I could give her what she needed." He paused. "I am still terrified of some of those things, but I am." He took a breath. "Ellen, I am so glad." She leaned against him on the porch bench, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the dark, while the spring night made its enormous sounds all around them, and she thought that she was going to need a larger kitchen garden. She told Nora the following week. They were in the sewing room, working on a new project that Nora had proposed independently, a quilt from scraps, because she had been reading about quilting in one of the books on Ellen's shelf and had decided she wanted to learn. Ellen told her while they were cutting squares in the same conversational way she had been using with Nora since the beginning, direct but not dramatic. Nora put down her shears. She looked at Ellen. "A baby," she said. "Yes. My baby," Nora said. Not a question. A statement of ownership, a declaration of stake. "Your brother or sister," Ellen confirmed. Nora picked up her shears. She started cutting again. "I am going to make the quilt for the baby," she said. "I will need more fabric." "We can go to Hartley's this Saturday," Ellen said. "I want yellow," Nora said, "and white, and perhaps the green because I have scraps left from my dress." "That will be beautiful," Ellen said. "I know," Nora said with an assurance that was entirely her own. The baby came in January of the following year, in 1880, the year Harlan Creek got a proper telegraph office and a second general store, and began to develop the particular momentum of a town that has decided to survive. Dr. Horace Finn delivered him on a Tuesday morning while Nora sat downstairs with Dottie Holloway and refused to be told to go to bed because it was past midnight and she was not going to sleep until she knew. Wallace sat in the bedroom with Ellen's hand in his, and the lamp turned high and said nothing useful for 12 hours, which was exactly what she needed him to do. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas, for no particular reason except that both of them had independently said the name over the previous weeks and looked at each other and recognized it as right. Thomas Wallace Redmond was born with a remarkable amount of dark hair and an immediate and comprehensive opinion about the world, which he expressed loudly and without reservation. Nora was allowed upstairs at 1:30 in the morning and stood at the bedside looking at her brother with an expression that combined the fearsome intensity of the Redmond dark eyes with something so open and soft that Ellen's chest ached. "He is very red," Nora observed. "All babies are," Ellen said. "He is loud," Nora said. "He comes by that honestly," Wallace said from the chair and looked at Ellen, and she laughed even though she was exhausted. "Can I hold him?" Nora asked. They arranged her carefully in the chair with the baby, and she held him with the careful confidence of someone who has decided they know how to do something and will not allow themselves to prove otherwise. And Thomas looked up at his sister with the unfocused wonder of the brand new, and Nora said, very quietly, "Hello, Thomas. I am your sister. I have been waiting for you." Wallace met Ellen's eyes over their daughter's head, and what moved between them in that moment was too large and too private for any language they had. The quilt was finished 2 weeks before Thomas was born, and it was extraordinary. Nora had spent 4 months on it, every free hour, working with an attention to detail that had become characteristic of her, and the pattern was her own invention, a combination of squares and triangles in yellow and white and green that was entirely original and entirely right. Ellen had helped at the beginning and then, gradually, had helped less and less, because Nora did not need help, and the quilt that lay in Thomas's cradle was fundamentally Nora's quilt, made for her brother by a 13-year-old who had learned to sew from her stepmother using her mother's fabric on a Saturday morning when the wind was coming from the north, and the first real change was beginning to move through the Redmond house. Spring of 1880 arrived and the ranch had its best season in 3 years. Cattle prices were good, and the water rights question was fully resolved, and the land was green from an unusually wet March. Wallace hired a third ranch hand, a young man named Abner Cole who was from Kentucky and had a pleasant disposition and an excellent work ethic and an almost superstitious terror of Nora, who was now 14, and had developed a version of the Redmond directness that was entirely her own and slightly more potent than her father's. Ellen was 30 years old in the spring of 1880. She stood on the porch one morning in April with Thomas on her hip, watching Nora come across the yard from the stable with her school bag over her shoulder and her green dress catching the wind. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off the Butterfield stage with a carpet bag and $43 and no particular idea of what was ahead. She thought about the blue calico and the cedar chest and the moment in the sewing room doorway that had been so full of pain and had also been the moment when everything truly started. The dress had not been a mistake. She understood that now fully, not as a rationalization but as a truth. The dress had done what nothing else had been able to do. It had opened the door. It had given Clara's grief somewhere to go. It had given Nora a way to claim her mother and welcome someone new in the same motion. And it had given Wallace a reason to say out loud what he had been thinking, which was that he had hoped for someone like her, and that the arrangement he wanted was not a practical one. 2 dresses from one bolt of fabric. One for the daughter, and one for the new woman who had come to be, in the most unplanned and most necessary way, part of the family that was building itself on the bones of what had come before. Wallace appeared behind her, put his hands on her shoulders, looked out at the yard where Nora was now arguing with Pete Sora about something regarding the proper way to mend a fence, which was none of Nora's business, and which she was nevertheless prepared to have strong opinions about. "She is going to run this ranch someday," Wallace said. "She is going to run more than this ranch," Ellen said. Thomas grabbed a handful of Ellen's hair and put it in his mouth, which was his current hobby. She extracted it with the practiced ease of a woman who has learned not to love anything too near her face. Wallace laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she heard regularly now but which she still found remarkable because she knew what it had cost him to find his way back to it. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, because he had learned to ask her this. "About the dress," she said. "The first one." "The blue calico," he said. "I was thinking that I am glad I did not know whose fabric it was," she said. "If I had known, I would not have cut it." And then none of this, she gestured, a gesture that encompassed the yard and the house and Thomas and the sound of Nora's voice carrying across the spring air. None of this would have happened the same way. He was quiet for a moment. "Clara used to say that the best things in her life were accidents that she would have avoided if she had been paying better attention." Ellen smiled. "She sounds like she was very wise." "She was," he said. "And she would have—" He stopped and then continued, and she heard that he had decided to say the thing rather than not say it, which was always how he operated, always the choice that made him who he was. "She would have been glad," he said. "For Nora, for me, and particularly for you." Ellen looked out at the yard. Nora had apparently won her argument with Pete Sara, who was now looking at a fence post with the expression of a man reconsidering his methodology. The spring sun was on everything, the red rock and the yellow grass and the green shoots coming up along the porch edge where Ellen had planted things in March without entirely knowing if they would take. They had taken. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For saying that," she said. "You did not have to." "I know I did not have to," he said. "That is when it matters most." She leaned back against him, Thomas still anchored on her hip, and felt the solid warmth of her husband against her back and the weight of her son in her arms, and the sound of her daughter's voice carrying across the Colorado spring air. And she thought that she had come here with $43 and a carpetbag and a skill with needle and thread, and that it had been, in every way that mattered, exactly enough. The Redmond household settled into its rhythms through the summer of 1880, with a quality of ease that did not mean the absence of difficulty, but the presence of enough foundation to bear difficulty without cracking. Thomas grew from his red and opinionated beginnings into a boy who was curious about absolutely everything and mobile well before anyone was entirely prepared for it. Nora graduated from the Harlan Creek School in the spring of 1881 at 15, the youngest in her class, and announced that she intended to continue her education, which was not a common ambition for girls in the territory, but which no one who knew Nora would have attempted to discourage. There was correspondence with a school in Denver. There was a long kitchen table conversation that lasted past midnight. There was the particular grief of distance and the particular necessity of letting go, which Wallace navigated with the same honest confrontation he brought to everything difficult. And Ellen sat beside him at the table, and they talked it through together, the way they had been talking through difficult things for 3 years. Nora went to Denver in the fall of 1881. She was 16 by then, and she went with her blue calico dress carefully packed, and her sewing case that Ellen had given her for her 15th birthday, and a quilt from her own bed that she had made herself in the spring from scraps of everything she had ever sewn. She went with a letter from Miss Calloway attesting to her academic ability and a financial arrangement that Wallace had organized, and that Nora had accepted with the grace of someone who intends to repay every cent of it, which she did, eventually, in her own time. At the stage, she hugged Ellen for a long time and said nothing. She hugged her father and said, against his shoulder, "You chose well," and Wallace made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else but was both. Then she was gone, and the house was different, and Thomas at 18 months had no idea why it was different but could sense it, and spent several days being particularly demanding in a way that Ellen suspected was some form of instinctive solidarity. Ellen discovered, in the winter of 1882, that she was expecting again. She told Wallace in the same way she had told him the first time, on the porch in the evening, in a sentence that was direct and calm, and contained an enormous amount of feeling held in careful reserve, because she was still, even now, a woman who had learned to hold things carefully. He responded differently than he had the first time. He did not need a moment. He turned to her on the porch bench and took her face in his hands carefully, the way a man holds something he values, and he looked at her with those direct dark eyes and said, "Good," and then kissed her, which was not their most elegant moment but was one of their truest. The second child was a girl, born in the September of 1882, when the territory was cooling toward another winter, and the house was full of the smell of Ellen's kitchen garden coming in for preserving. They named her Clara. They had talked about it carefully, both of them, over the preceding weeks, and they had arrived at it together, not as a memorial that outweighed the present but as a continuity that honored it. Nora, when she came home for Christmas that year and was shown her sister, said, after a long moment of looking at the small sleeping face in the cradle, "That is exactly right." And then more quietly, "Thank you." Ellen put her arm around Nora's shoulders and felt the young woman who had replaced the difficult girl, the Nora who had been building herself quietly into something formidable and clear-eyed, and full of Clara Redmond's practical wisdom and Wallace Redmond's incorruptible honesty. "You have nothing to thank me for," Ellen said. "I have a great deal to thank you for," Nora said. "I think you know that." "Then we are even," Ellen said. "Because I have a great deal to thank you for as well." Nora looked at her. "What did I do?" "You cried," Ellen said. "That first day, when you saw the dress, you opened the door." Nora considered this. She looked back at the sleeping baby. "I did not mean to." "The best things usually start that way," Ellen said. Thomas came thundering down the stairs at this moment demanding to see his sister, and the sentimental moment dissolved into the ordinary beautiful chaos of a household that was full and alive, and building itself forward, year by year, piece by piece, from what had come before and what was being made now. The way that all good things are built, with care and intention and the occasional accident of grace that you would have avoided if you had been paying better attention. The blue calico dresses hung in the cedar chest in the storeroom, both of them, side by side, because neither Ellen nor Nora could quite bring themselves to pack them away entirely, and neither could quite bring themselves to wear them too often. They were both still beautiful. They were both, by now, too small for either of their current wearers, because time does that to things, but the beauty did not diminish with the fitting. Clara Redmond's fabric had become three things: the daughter's dress and the stepmother's dress, and the story that lived between them, and pulled the family into what it was. Wallace found Ellen in the sewing room one evening in the spring of 1883, sitting at the cutting table with baby Clara asleep in the cradle beside her and a piece of new calico in her hands, pale yellow this time, measuring. He leaned against the doorframe the way Nora used to, watching. "What are you making?" he asked. "I have not decided yet," she said. "I am measuring first." He came into the room and sat on the edge of the cutting table and looked at the yellow calico and then at his sleeping daughter and then at his wife. Ellen felt his eyes on her and looked up. "What?" she said. "I was just thinking," he said. "About what?" "About a woman who got off a stage in Harlan Creek," he said, "and told me she was not easily deterred." "That was a long time ago," she said. 4.5 years, he said. "That is not a long time," she said. "No," he said. "I suppose it is not." He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, a gesture that was entirely unself-conscious and entirely habitual and entirely full of every year of the 4.5. "It feels full," he said. 4.5 years of full. "Versus empty," she said. "Versus before," he said. "Not empty, Clara was never empty, but before." "Full and before," she said. "Yes," he said simply. She set down the yellow calico. She put her hand over his on the cutting table. They sat in the sewing room with the baby sleeping and the spring coming through the window, and the house making its house sounds all around them, and the ordinary extraordinary fact of their shared life settled around them like something well made, something cut carefully from the right fabric, stitched with attention, worn in, fitted properly to the bodies and the lives it was made for. Thomas called from somewhere downstairs, something urgent and incomprehensible in the way of 4-year-olds, and Wallace stood and went to investigate, and Ellen picked up the yellow calico and kept measuring, and outside the Colorado Spring was doing what it did, which was to insist, unreasonably and beautifully, on beginning again. The years that followed had the particular quality of a life that is being genuinely lived rather than managed. There were good cattle years and one very difficult one in 1884 when the summer went dry and the grass burned and 3 neighboring ranches sold out, and Wallace spent 6 months in the tight-jawed way that Ellen had learned to read and respond to, not with solutions but with steadiness, which was what he needed and what she had. They made it through. They made it through because he was methodical, and because she ran the house with zero waste, and because Cass Holloway had 60 years of ranch knowledge and Pete Sora had the energy of someone who does not yet know that things can defeat you. Nora came home from Denver in the summer of 1884 with a certificate in education and a mind that had been additionally sharpened by 2 years of teachers who knew what to do with it. And she spent the summer in Harlan Creek teaching at the school while Miss Calloway, who had finally married and become Mrs. Whitmore, was confined with her first child. Nora taught with the Redmond directness and a pedagogical intelligence that made the children of Harlan Creek work harder than they had ever worked and feel better about it than they would have expected. She returned to Denver in the fall, not to school this time, but to a position in a larger school there. She wrote letters that were long and specific and funny, and occasionally asked Ellen for advice about things that had nothing to do with sewing. Ellen answered every letter with equal length and equal specificity. This was its own kind of love, the love that travels on paper, and it was real and sustaining. Thomas at 4 was a force of nature with dark hair and his mother's eyes and his father's way of going completely still when he was thinking hard about something. He was interested in everything mechanical, anything that moved or could be made to move, which meant that by the time he was 5 the kitchen garden gate had been disassembled and reassembled in 3 different configurations, and the pump handle in the yard had been taken apart and put back in a way that worked better than it had before, which made Wallace look at his son with the expression of a man who is trying not to be too obviously delighted. Clara, at 2, was a small and certain person who had her name and her nature in some instinctive balance, combining the practicality that had been reported of the first Clara with a cheerfulness that was entirely her own. She followed Thomas everywhere and had no fear of anything that Thomas was not afraid of, which was almost everything, and Ellen watched her children together in the yard and felt something so large and so uncomplicated that she did not try to name it. The 5th anniversary of Ellen and Wallace's wedding came in April 1884, and they marked it quietly, the way they marked most things, with supper together after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and Wallace produced a bottle of wine that had come from somewhere improbable, and they sat at the kitchen table as they had been sitting at kitchen tables together for 5 years, and he said, 5 years. 5 years, she agreed. Are you, he paused. Are you content here with this? She looked at him. Ask me a harder question, she said. He smiled fully, one of those complete smiles that still had the quality of something earned. All right, he said. Do you ever think about Denver, about what you might have done instead? She considered this honestly because he deserved honest consideration of every question. Sometimes, she said. I think about the woman I was then. I do not miss her particularly. She was managing. She was not living. And now I am living, she said. Now I am completely, ridiculously, irreversibly living. She paused. Does that answer both questions? Yes, he said. Yes, it does. He poured the wine, and they sat in the kitchen they had shared for 5 years. And outside the April wind moved across the territory, and the cattle were quiet in the lower pasture, and Thomas was asleep with his boots on again, and baby Clara was asleep with her arms flung wide in the way of someone who has no reservations about the world, and the lamp burned steadily on the table, and Wallace Redmond and Ellen Brooks Redmond sat in the full and generous life they had built from the unexpected. From a bolt of blue calico and an honest question and a woman who was not easily deterred, the cedar chest still sat in the sewing room. Ellen had never moved it. She had never moved it because it was not hers to move. It was Nora's, and it was Wallace's, and it was the territories, and it was the past's. She had simply learned to be at home beside it, which was how you lived alongside the loves that came before you, not by erasing them or competing with them, but by existing beside them with enough steadiness that the people who needed to carry both could do so without falling. In 1886, Nora came home again. She came home for Christmas with a man named Daniel Holt, a schoolteacher from Denver who was 32, and had a quiet dignity and a habit of observing before speaking that Ellen recognized as a quality she respected. She watched her stepdaughter introduce him to Wallace at the front door with the particular combination of certainty and hope that belongs to a person who is bringing someone important to a place that is important and trusting both to hold. Wallace shook Daniel Holt's hand and said nothing for a moment and then said, "Come in and sit down and we will get to know each other," which was the only welcome that mattered. Christmas of 1886 was large and loud, and contained within it the full history of what the Redmond family had become. Thomas was 6 and had, for reasons no one could fully explain, become devoted to Daniel Holt within 48 hours, which Wallace found both amusing and slightly suspicious. Clara was 4 and climbed onto Nora's lap and refused to get off for most of the first evening, which Nora seemed to find entirely acceptable. Ellen made enough food for 12 people for 3 days, and Wallace chopped enough wood to heat the house for a week, which was excessive and entirely characteristic of his approach to any situation that felt important to him. On the second day of Nora's visit, they were in the sewing room together, just the two of them, Nora looking at the cedar chest and Ellen sitting at the cutting table with a new project, and Nora said, "I want you to know that Daniel knows about Mama, about all of it. I told him before I brought him here." "I assumed you had," Ellen said. "He said," Nora paused. "He said that the people we love who are gone are not competition for the people we love who are here, that there is enough room." "He is right about that," Ellen said. "He sounds like you," Nora said. Ellen looked up. Nora was looking at her with those dark eyes, and there was in her expression something that had been absent for a long time and was now permanently present, a quality of being at home in her own life. "Or you sound like me," Ellen said. "You have been listening carefully for a decade." Nora almost smiled, the almost smile that was her father's and also entirely her own. "I have," she said. "It has been very educational." She opened the cedar chest. She looked at the 2 blue calico dresses for a long time. Then she turned to Ellen. "When Clara is old enough," she said, "I want her to have these dresses to know about the story of them." "She will know," Ellen said. "Good," Nora said. She closed the chest. She sat down on the edge of it the way she used to sit on the edge of things when she was 12 and waiting to decide whether to trust something. "I'm going to say yes to Daniel," she said. "He has not asked me formally yet, but he is going to." "I know," Ellen said. "How do you know?" "Because he asked your father's permission yesterday morning in the stable while they thought I was in the kitchen," Ellen said. "And your father gave it." Nora stared at her. "My father asked your opinion first." "He did not have to ask," Ellen said. "I gave it voluntarily several days ago." Nora laughed, and the laugh was full and unguarded, and was one of the most beautiful sounds Ellen had ever heard. "Of course you did," Nora said. "Daniel Holt proposed on the last evening of the Christmas visit, in the parlor in front of everyone, which either showed considerable courage or complete ignorance of what that room full of Redmonds was capable of. And Nora said yes with the decisive simplicity of someone who has thought about something thoroughly and is done thinking. The sewing room was busy in the following months. Ellen and Nora, in the letters that traveled between Harlan Creek and Denver, planned a dress together, the letters going back and forth with sketches and measurements and discussions of fabric and trim. They settled on a cream wool, not the blue calico this time, because that had been and was its own thing, but something new, made for what was new. Ellen cut and began and sent progress reports. Nora sent additions and changes, which were always reasonable, and which Ellen incorporated without resentment, because she had been listening to Nora's instincts for 9 years and they were consistently excellent. The dress was finished 2 months before the wedding. Ellen sent it to Denver by stage, packed in a flat box with tissue paper and a sprig of dried lavender from the kitchen garden. Nora's letter back was 3 pages long and the last paragraph said only, "It is exactly right, exactly you, exactly what Mama's fabric taught us. Thank you for teaching me the thing behind the thing." Wallace read that paragraph over Ellen's shoulder in the kitchen and said nothing. He put his hand briefly on the back of her neck and then walked outside to the porch. And Ellen folded the letter carefully and thought about the blue calico and the cedar chest and the Saturday morning with the north wind. And she thought that some things begin in grief and difficulty, an apparent mistake, and arrive, if you stay with them, if you refuse to be deterred, at something that is worth every hard turn of the road that brought you there. The year 1887 held the wedding of Nora Redmond and Daniel Holt, and in the summer of that year, Thomas turned 7 and could already outshoot Pete Sora with a slingshot, and had strong opinions about the inferior quality of the Harlan Creek schoolhouse roof, which he had inspected from the outside, and reported to his father with a specificity that suggested he had been up on it, which he denied with insufficient convincingness. Clara turned 5 and began attending the school herself, and was, according to Mrs. Whitmore, the most organized 5-year-old she had ever taught, which did not surprise anyone. And in the fall of 1887, on a September evening with the first cold coming in from the north, Wallace and Ellen sat on the porch and Ellen told him that they were expecting their 3rd child, and he said the same thing he had said the second time, without hesitation, with his hands on her face. Good. He was better, she thought, at saying the right thing than he gave himself credit for. He had always said that Clara had said he was better at being told than at thinking of things himself, and Nora had qualified that with the observation that he was better at being told than at announcing, but that his thinking was excellent. Ellen thought they were both right and both missing the larger point, which was that Wallace Redmond had always known what mattered and had always, in the end, acted accordingly. He had known that something was not working in his household, and he had done something about it. He had known that the woman who got off the stage was more than what he had asked for, and he had found a way to say so. He had known that Nora needed space and time and not to be rushed, and he had waited. He had known that grief was not something to be solved, but something to be weathered together, and he had been willing to weather it. The 3rd child was born in the spring of 1888, another boy, which Thomas announced to the yard in a voice that suggested the whole territory needed to be informed. They named him James, and he arrived with the same dark Redmond hair and the same frank dark eyes, and a temperament that was from the first moment the most contented of the 3, which Ellen found both lovely and slightly suspicious, as though the universe were offering a balance of temperaments that she had not requested but was willing to accept. The house was full. The ranch was good. The territory was changing, Harlan Creek growing in its slow, determined way toward the town it was going to become, with a new schoolhouse whose roof Thomas had not yet inspected from the outside, as far as anyone knew. The Song family's laundry was still on the main street, and was still subjected to the casual cruelties of a society that had not yet found its better instincts on the matter. And Ellen continued to find small ways to push back against this, as she always had, as she would continue to do, because some things were simply wrong, and she had learned a long time ago that wrong things required people who were willing to say so, and to do what small things they could. Nora wrote from Denver that she was expecting. That letter arrived in October 1888, and Wallace read it at the kitchen table and looked up at Ellen with an expression that she had not seen before and that took her a moment to identify, and then she placed it. It was the expression of a man who is looking at the evidence that the world he loves is continuing forward. A grandfather's expression, inhabited for the first time and finding it good. He passed her the letter. She read it. She set it down. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "You are going to be insufferable about this," she said. "I am going to be extremely reasonable about this," he said, with a dignity that was entirely undermined by the degree of visible emotion on his face. "You are going to write back immediately," she said. "I am going to write back tonight," he corrected. She laughed and he laughed, and James, in his basket near the stove, slept through all of it, indifferent to legacy and continuity in the uncomplicated way of infants who are warm and fed and certain of their welcome. Ellen went to the sewing room that evening, after the children were settled and Wallace was at the table writing his letter to Denver. She lit the lamp. She sat at the cutting table with nothing in particular in her hands. She looked at the cedar chest. She thought about a September day in 1878 when a woman with a carpetbag and $43 had stepped off a stage and shaken hands with a man who was standing apart from the crowd with his hat in his hands and something quietly hopeful in his steady dark eyes. She thought about the way that life had moved from that moment, not in a straight line, not without difficulty, not without the kind of error that comes from good intentions and incomplete information, but with a continuity of purpose, a direction that had remained true through everything that tried to complicate it. She thought about 2 dresses made from one bolt of blue calico. One for a daughter who had not wanted a new dress until she decided to help make one, and then they had made 2. The second dress, made from what was left, had become hers, had become the sign of an offer and a welcome, and a belonging she had not been certain was possible before she arrived in Harlan Creek and found that it was. She opened the cedar chest. She looked at the 2 blue dresses, folded and still perfect, a little small now for either of their wearers, but unchanged in everything that mattered. She thought about Nora saying that her mother would have been glad. She thought about Wallace saying that he thought of it as building on what came before. She reached in and touched the fabric very gently with the tips of her fingers. "Thank you," she said to Clara Redmond, to the woman she had never met and knew entirely, whose fabric had started everything and whose generosity of spirit lived in every inch of the life her family was still building. "Thank you for the fabric," she said, "and for Nora and for this." She closed the chest. She picked up her sewing case, the leather one with the brass clasp that Wallace had given her for Christmas in her first year here, and she took out the needles and the thread, and she began to cut the fabric she had measured last week for the quilt she was going to make for Nora's coming baby, because that was the thing she could do. That was the specific and particular contribution she could make to what was being built. And it was enough, and it was right, and she was here, and she was home. And the lamp burned steadily in the sewing room of the Redmond house, while outside the Colorado autumn moved across the red and yellow land in the enormous quiet way of something that has been going on since before anyone alive could remember and intends to continue. Wallace appeared in the doorway. "Letter is written," he said. "Come and sit with me," she said. He came in and sat on the edge of the cedar chest, the way Nora used to sit, and watched her cut fabric in the lamplight, and neither of them needed to say anything about what this room contained or what it meant, because they had been living inside the meaning of it for 10 years and they both knew it in every part of themselves, and that was the whole story, and it was a good one, and it was not finished.